Hello and welcome to News Warrior. I am Nitin Gokhale and this is BharatShakti.in's own videocast. Of late, especially over the last 3 to 4 years, the Indian Armed Forces have suddenly raised the frequency of their joint exercises and bilateral visits by their chiefs of the three armed forces to different friendly countries much more than ever before. Just take the example of what has happened over the last month and a half or so. The Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal B.S. Dhanawa was in Japan for a 4-day visit. Chief of Naval Staff Admiral Sunil Lanba was in Russia trying to reaffirm the old ties with an old friend. The Army Chief General Bipin Rawat, as we speak, is currently in Africa touring 2 or 3 different countries there. It's the first ever visit of the Indian Army Chief bilaterally to different African countries, which shows the importance that India is now trying to give to our friends in Africa. And not just the visits of the 3 chiefs, but the number of exercises, the joint exercises, have suddenly gone up in the past few years. Just right now in India itself, on the east coast of India, the Indian Air Force is exercising with the American Air Force at Kalaikunda, and simultaneously another unit of the Indian Air Force is carrying out a joint exercise with their Russian counterparts. This perhaps has never happened, where the Americans and the Russians both are jointly exercising with the Indian Air Force. The Russian exercise is taking place at Jodhpur on the western border of India, and as I mentioned, the Americans are doing the COPE India exercise with India at Kalaikonda. That said, several naval exercises, port visits by Indian naval ships, Indian warships has dramatically risen over the past few years, and the Indian naval ships have gone where they have never gone before, to Australia more frequently, to Japan, to the RIMPAC exercise on the in the Pacific on the US West Coast. The visits are also to the African countries, and remember that the patrolling done by the Indian naval ships in the exclusive economic zone has also become a very frequent occurrence, raising the operational tempo of the Indian Navy to a far greater height than it has been done ever before. Of course, there are concerns about whether the wear and tear of the ships will be sustainable in the long run, but at the moment the interesting part is that the military diplomacy, which is part of the overall diplomacy that India conducts, has got a leg up from the government, and the joint exercises range from the land exercises between forces of even smaller countries like Nepal and Sri Lanka and Maldives in the neighborhood, but also the old exercises that have been happening with the United States, the UK and France. These exercises have also continued to be raised in their scope and size over the years. Interestingly, India's biggest adversary, China, is of course the challenge that India faces is a strategic challenge, and yet as we speak, the Indian contingent of about 250 strong soldiers is currently doing a joint exercise with their People's Liberation Army counterparts in China. Exercise hand in hand, which had begun in 2007, had of course some of the hiccups in between and some obstacles when the relationship between India and China had deteriorated, especially in 2010 and then in 2017 when the Dolam or the Doklam crisis had happened. But the relationship is back on track, and therefore exercise hand in hand has been revived, as I said, is being conducted right now in China. But that is not the highlight alone of these frequent and these increased engagements that the Indian military is doing with different forces. There are multilateral exercises that have happened and are being planned. For instance, there was one multilateral exercise with BIMSTEC countries that was conducted in Pune along with a BIMSTEC summit in 2016 and again in 2018, this year in Pune itself. There is another exercise, multilateral exercise planned with at least 16 to 17 African countries, which is again going to happen in March 2019 with the Indian forces or the Indian Army. And interestingly, for the first time, the Russian military conducted a tri-service exercise with Indian service headquarters or Indian armed forces, all the three armed forces, for the first time in Russia earlier this year in 2018. Perhaps taking a cue from there, the Americans don't want to be left behind, and now they have proposed that there should be a tri-service. That means all the three services, Army, Navy, Air Force, must conduct a joint exercise with the Indian Army, Navy, Air Force in US in 2019. Clearly, India is the flavor of the season and flavor of the moment, really, the Indian Armed Forces, and they are being wooed and they are being engaged by very disparate and different countries just to understand how the Indian forces operate. So from an adversary like China to old friends like Russia and Japan are conducting joint exercises. Interestingly, at the counterinsurgency and jungle warfare school in India's northeast at Vairangte, the Japanese land forces for the first time ever had a joint exercise with Indian forces about 3 months ago. So what is the purpose of all this heightened frequency of these joint exercises? One, of course, the interoperability that comes in with frequent exchanges, the learning value that these exercises bring to both sides when they exercise jointly. And third, it also shows that military diplomacy, where weapons get displayed, weapons get used, each other's weapons, platforms, tactics, all that gets exchanged, and both the armed forces of both sides or multilateral countries who engage with India and India engages with them get to learn from each other, various practices, various ethos, all that happens, and that just raises the profile of the Indian armed forces. So clearly it's a costly proposition really, but the government has decided that this is one way of increasing the engagement with different countries, friendly, neutral and even adversarial countries like China. Except Pakistan, I think India does exercises with most other countries in the world, and therefore the Indian armed forces remain very much in demand across the globe, and gives India that much heft in diplomacy, the overall diplomacy that Prime Minister Modi is known to be pushing for raising India's profile worldwide. So the military clearly is one of the major components to raise India's profile across the globe and of course amongst the armed forces of different countries. If you have any other suggestions, please let us know so that we can take up this topic for discussion in the next edition of this videocast called News Warrior. Until then, this is Nitin Gokhale saying goodbye.